I'm Tommie Shelby. I'm a professor of African and African American studies and a professor of philosophy at Harvard University. And I'm going to talk for a minute about the idea of prison abolition. When people hear the word prison abolition or are first introduced to the idea, they immediately react, that's a crazy idea. And in a sense in which it is a crazy idea, as a philosopher, I like crazy ideas and am interested in reflecting on the idea that seems unthinkable. Sometimes it turns out that the crazy idea has a lot of merit. And sometimes even when it doesn't have a lot of merit, it brings a certain understanding, just reflecting on the idea and asking yourself what there is to be said in favor of it or perhaps against it. So maybe I'd start by just talking about what prison abolition is. Prison abolition is a very old idea in a lot of ways. There were people in the 19th century who defended it in Europe, who were anarchists, some of them socialists. It extends into the contemporary world largely through movements that are focused on the problem of mass incarceration in the United States. So central figures will be someone like Angela Davis, who's probably the leading philosopher in the prison abolition movement. And when I think of the idea, I think of it as committed to maybe sort of two main thoughts. One thought is that prisons are an ineffective and an immoral way to try to prevent or control or respond to the problem of harmful wrongdoing. And the other thought is that when you think about the problem of mass incarceration or the problem of prisons in general, what you have to think about is the fact that there are background social conditions that we live in that make this practice seem natural and inevitable. And what that indicates is that what we need to turn our attention to is transforming those social conditions so that a practice like imprisonment isn't really necessary. Now you might ask, well, why reflect on such an idea? Why think that's worth doing? Well, part of it is for those people, and I include myself, who think of themselves as prison reformers, who think that we need a really radical change in the way in which we handle crime in our world, and that we overuse prisons to try to deal with the problem of crime. And I think a challenge like prison abolition forces us to ask, whether this is really an adequate response to the problem. Perhaps something more radical is really called for. And I think it's worth sort of testing your commitments against a radical idea just to help you see whether those commitments are really worth your allegiance. But I guess another reason to reflect on whether prison abolition has merit is because it's very easy to take a practice like that for granted because it's existed so long and it's ubiquitous, and it's easy to think it's just natural and inevitable that you have it. But when you think about it, you realize prisons haven't always existed, and there are practices that have existed for a long time and were even universal at one time, like, say, patriarchy. And we don't think that that's an adequate justification for it. Its widespread, ubiquitous use is not enough to defend it. And when you're dealing with a practice like imprisonment, which clearly involves great harm and suffering, not only to the imprisoned, but often to their families and their communities, this is the kind of practice that calls for, I think, a serious, thoughtful justification. And philosophers, of course, have spent a lot of time thinking about justice and what it requires. It's the classic questions in philosophy. And philosophers have also spent a lot of time thinking about the justification of punishment. How could it be that you can, by imposing harm on someone, somehow produce something good from doing that? And philosophers reflect on that for a long time. And so I think in this case, prison abolition, I think, is ripe for that kind of philosophical reflection, to ask ourselves, is this a practice we really should endorse? Should we be trying to transcend it? what could possibly justify imposing such severe suffering and deprivation on people, even when they've done something seriously wrong. And when you compare it to other philosophical questions, even political questions around punishment, you can kind of see the merit of reflecting on it. So take something like the death penalty. Many people think the death penalty is wrong, even if it were effective at preventing, say, violent crime or homicide. Some people still think it would be wrong. People think something similar about torture or maiming as punishments that at one time were, again, widespread. So I think you can take a question like this and ask, even if you think some kind of punishment is justified, is this particular form of penalizing others one that we should continue to embrace? Or should we abandon it, as many people have abandoned torture or maiming, and in many places, the death penalty? Now you might think, well, maybe it's worth thinking about, but it's just a utopian idea, and maybe it's really not worth the trouble because we know we have dangerous people we have to deal with, and this is the best we can do. And so you might wonder, well, what good is it to kind of think about this utopian idea? And I'd be first to admit that there are some aspects of utopian thinking that could be worrisome, like if it's rooted in wishful thinking, if it's not rooted in a scientific understanding of human behavior and what's possible, that might give us a reason to be skeptical of that kind of utopian reflection. There are things about human nature we don't fully understand, and maybe there's a tendency to have a very rosy conception of human nature or how malleable our dispositions are. And of course, if we're not willing to consider the limits of human nature and how malleable our natures are, then that would call for a kind of wishful thinking. You would just be suspicious that it's a useful kind of exercise. But I think there are real pros to taking up a utopian outlook, to allowing our imagination to reflect on things that seem far-fetched, or at least something that we could really only achieve in the distant future. Part of that is to give received ideas common sense, the kind of critical scrutiny that it requires. And I think this is an occasion where that kind of utopian reflection can help us to not just kind of go with whatever common sense happens to tell us is the right thing. I think it's also true that because it is a harmful practice and it will be better if we could do without it, it encourages us to experiment, to think about what are the other ways that we could respond to harmful wrongdoing that doesn't involve such severe deprivations of other people's freedom, and ways that kind of limit their life prospects and shape their lives until their end. So when you think about the pros of utopian reflection, I think, one, it forces you to reflect on received ideas and common practices that really deserve our scrutiny. And in this case, we're talking about a clearly harmful practice. And that's the kind of thing that we should always be thinking about. How could we do better? Could we find a way to control harmful wrongdoing, to protect other people's rights without having to impose severe hardships on others? And that can encourage us to actually experiment with other ways, less harmful ways of responding to this very serious problem. And I think that kind of experimentation should even lead us to think about, well, are there things about the very social conditions that we live in, the form of society that we inhabit, whether it itself needs serious transformation, so that we might be able to live in a world, if not free of the practice of imprisonment, at least one where it has a much, much smaller footprint than it currently does.